My adjournment debate is in relation to the Fines Act of 2010 that to date has not been implemented or enacted as far as I can see. And the question is why? And it does have a lot of good content in it. One of the contents is that fines can be paid by instalments. Another is that it has the power to appoint a receiver where there's default on fine payments. Another thing that's contained in it is community service order if somebody fails to pay a fine. There's also publication of list of defaulters. And also there's recognition of the fact that some people may not have the capacity to repay a fine. Now, on top of the fact that this law or this act has not been implemented, there's also a general scheme of fines amendment bill 2012 waiting in the wings to be dealt with as well. And that also contains a lot of good quality stuff, whereby if somebody refuses to pay a fine, that there can be an attachment order put on their wages. There is the power to have data sharing between the Revenue Commissioners and the Department of Social Protection. And basically, it also could go as far as being in a position to deduct a fine from somebody's social welfare payment on a weekly deduction basis for 12 months. And the reason I think, Minister, that this is very important that it is brought in immediately is I had a situation there last week where I was talking to a litter warden, and they told me that a particular man who had a trailer load of domestic refuse at the front of his house, that they had issued a fine to him, and they had told him to bring the refuse to a landfill and come back with a receipt that they had actually dumped the stuff legally. He told them 3 weeks later that he had no intention of doing it, that his solicitor told him the worst he would get is 2 days in jail. And he said last year he owed €1,500 in motor offence fines. He didn't pay that either. And he got 5 hours in Castlereagh prison. And he boasted to the engineer from the council that the biggest inconvenience that was there for him was that he had to actually hitch a lift from the prison 11 miles home. That was the biggest inconvenience. So while we're not enacting these acts that give us the power to most certainly get our money, we're actually wasting money. And we're wasting money by not collecting the fine, by further court appearances and the cost associated, and ultimately sending somebody to jail and the cost of that as well. So obviously, if there was a system in place, Minister, that people knew, if there was a system in place, Minister, that people knew that if they were fined, that they would have to ultimately pay it, there would be less situations arising where they'd be fined in the first place.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Senator, and sorry for putting you under such pressure, but I could guarantee you that after that race to be here, you're probably the warmest person in here. The rest of us are freezing. I would like to thank Senator Kelly for raising this important issue, and I am speaking on behalf of Minister Alan Shatter, who is the Minister for Justice, Equality and Defence, and who is unable to be present due to other business. The Minister welcomes the opportunity to clarify for the Senator the current position in relation to the Fines Act 2010. That Act, as the Senator is aware, covers a number of issues. Part 2 of the Act provides for the indexation of fines, and those provisions were commenced on the 4th of January 2011. Part 3, which is the focus of the Senator's question, provides for a reform system for the payment and recovery of fines. Section 14 of the Act provides that a judge must take the financial circumstances of the person into account when he or she is fixing a fine. This important section, which is intended to ensure that insofar as possible the fine imposed is proportionate to the person's financial means, was also commenced in January 2011. The remaining sections of the Act have not been commenced. As the Senator knows, the programme for government includes a commitment to provide for the recovery of fines by attachment of earnings. In the course of the preparation of the legislative scheme to provide for attachment of earnings, it became clear to the Minister that the architecture of the fines payment and recovery system provided for in the 2010 Act would need to be substantially amended. if attachment was to operate efficiently and effectively. To that end, he examined all aspects of the payment and recovery provisions in the 2010 Act and prepared the Scheme of Fines Amendment Bill, which was approved for drafting by the Government last October. The first reform contained in the scheme relates to the payment of fines by instalment. Under the 2010 Act, a person had to apply to and convince the court that their financial situation was such that they should be allowed to pay a fine by instalment. The new bill will instead provide an automatic right to pay a fine by instalments to everyone on whom a fine is imposed. The next reform is in relation to recovery of assets to pay a fine. Under the 2010 Act, a recovery order appointing a receiver to collect a fine, including by the sale of the assets of the defaulter, was to be imposed in all cases where the person failed to pay a fine. Rather than having receivers appointed in all cases, including those where the person has no assets to recover, the Minister has decided that recovery will become one of a number of options available to the court where a person fails to pay a fine in full by the due date. The other options being attachment of earnings, which I mentioned earlier, and community service, which is already provided for in the 2010 Act. The Minister is confident that the introduction of attachment of earnings, taken together with receivership and community service, and the other reforms mentioned earlier, will all but eliminate the need to send anyone to prison for the non-payment of fines. The Minister is anxious to have the Fines Amendment Bill published and enacted as soon as possible, and can assure the Senator that in the meantime the Court Service is proceeding to put in place the necessary IT systems to support the new regime. I would like to thank Senator Kelly for raising this important issue, and hope that he will agree that the new bill, when enacted, will achieve our shared objective of ensuring that the fines imposed by the Court are collected to the greatest extent possible, and that where, for whatever reason, a person fails to pay a fine, viable alternatives to imprisonment are available to the justice system.
Thank you, Minister. Senator, briefly.
Thank you, Minister. I appreciate the response that was written for the Minister, and you're just delivering it on his behalf. And basically, you have said, with that answer, everything that I have already said in my presentation, what's actually in it. The question is, when is it going to be implemented? And it's not been implemented. And I think maybe the Minister needs to be told, Minister for Justice needs to be told that the necessary IT systems have to be in place after 3 years of a bill being passed into law and not one part of it enacted doesn't really wash, because in actual fact all of this could be done manually, never mind needing an IT system. You could proceed with collecting fines on a manual basis without having to have a computer. It was done for years and years and years before computerisation. So I think it's important that it's done as soon as possible, Minister, and I'd like if you'd pass that message on to the Minister.
Could I just, because I think we might misunderstand one another, the Minister has drafted a new bill, the Fines Amendment Bill, and he would like to have that published and enacted as soon as possible. As you can imagine, the weight of legislation that needs to be drawn up in terms of other issues is enormous. In relation to the Fines Bill, Fines Act 2010, there have been 3 elements of that already enacted. It is the attachments piece and how we can deal with people who clearly, like the case that you cited, who clearly are defiant and do not wish and would prefer that we would give them maybe 2 weeks to a month in prison and have it wiped out. It's that issue that he feels needs to be tightened up, and so therefore he has drafted a new piece of legislation. But I think we're all on the one page, Senator.
Thank you very much.